Everyone. Today, I'm so excited to have Evelina Pituch with us today. She is one of the rising stars in the field of parenting with disabilities. I'm sure she would say a little something about that, but to me, she's definitely is. And so I am thrilled that we are able to speak with her today on this podcast. So Evelina, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Marjorie.
So I know you've listened to all the episodes. We were talking about it just a little bit earlier. So you know that the first question is actually to ask you how you started in the field. And so I would like for you to let us know, how did you start?
Sure, absolutely. I would say, so unlike the other guests you've had on your podcast, it wasn't a single family or parent that impacted my entry upon the field. I think it was a series of somewhat unrelated events that now reflecting back on those, I definitely can connect the dots and see why I've entered the field and don't want to go anywhere else now. I think it all starts back when I was actually an undergrad. So I was studying occupational therapy at the University of Montreal. I was in my second year, so that was almost 10 years ago. And I was doing a clinical placement in a Montreal-based adult physical rehabilitation facility here in Montreal. And you know, when you're doing your placements, you get, of course, to get to know your future clinical work. And on one given afternoon, we were allowed to see other occupational therapists or OTs practicing within that facility, but in a different program, say the spinal cord injury program, the specialized driving program. And on that afternoon, it was actually my first encounter with a special program, which is called the Parents Plus Clinic, which is located, like I said, in the heart of Montreal at the CIUS Centre-Sud de l'Île de Montréal. And I was absolutely fascinated by the kind of practice that the clinical OTs had at Parents Plus. So basically, the OT that greeted us there, the interns, she showed all the parenting adaptive equipment that was created all those years by OTs with the help of technicians and mechanics. And so I was able to see those adapted cribs with lateral openings, or adapted breastfeeding cushions, or again, adapted bassinets for parents taking care of their babies. And I thought, geez, that is such a beautiful practice to be actually able, as a healthcare professional, help other parents in perhaps what is one of the most, if not the most meaningful activity they're doing in their daily lives. So I would say that was the first event. Then a year after, I was still an intern, but I was doing actually a summer research internship. So at the current research center where I'm currently conducting my PhD studies. So it's kind of funny when I reflect on how it all started. And at the School of Rehabilitation at the University of Montreal, there's this annual scientific day. And it always ends with a special guest for a series of conference. And it was actually the 60th anniversary of the school. So they had a number of guests aligned. And one of those invited speakers was actually Dr. Lisa Yazzoni. Perhaps some of you who are listening to the podcast may know her work. And her conference was entitled, How Did That Happen? Societal Views of Pregnant Women with Disabilities. And I remember how I was listening to her talk like on my chair, and I thought it was great research that she's conducted with her colleagues. Again, the topic of motherhood and mothering and all the societal biases that were involved in that significant daily life role kind of hit me. And I do recall at that time, at the end of the conference, I asked the question to Dr. Yazzoni. I don't remember what the question was, but I do remember that someone from the audience turned back and told me, and it's someone I don't know, I don't remember who it was, if it was a professor or a clinician or a clinical manager, I don't remember, but that person looked me and said, "Oh, you're going to research that topic." And it's kind of funny when I think back at that moment, because it wasn't my intention at first to be actually a student researcher. I was really in OT with my head aligned with being a clinician, right? So that's kind of funny when I think back about that moment. So that was kind of the second event that was meaningful for me. And I encourage you to actually read that paper from Dr. Yazzoni, which I think it was published in 2015. It's basically called How Did That Happen? Public Responses to Women with Mobility Disability During Pregnancy. And for me, it was one of those first scholarly papers I've read that were really meaningful for me. And I think the third event that kind of put everything in perspective, I was in my final year of my curriculum in occupational therapy. So I was in my professional master's. I was finishing my last series of courses before actually being an occupational therapist in just about a few months. I was following an optional course given by Dr. Carolina Bottari, who ended up being my current PhD supervisor, but at that time she was only a professor to me. And that course was basically about cognitive rehabilitation and how, as OTs, we can promote or facilitate, should I say, daily living for adults who have any kind of cognitive impairments. And in that class, she showed us some preliminary data she was collecting with Parents Plus, actually. She was utilizing video-based methods. So she was actually video recording how parent. And I do remember she showed some excerpts of that video. It was a young mother taking care of her baby. And I remember how moved I was by that video. She had a series of difficulties actually in that video. It was actually, I can remember very clearly, she was giving a bath to her baby. And she was like in this so small apartment. The bathroom was very narrow, and she was kind of struggling in managing her baby, herself in maneuvering her wheelchair in that very tiny physical space she had. And I think it's when it actually hit me the most. So as a occupational therapist, and if I may read the definition of the Canadian Association of OTs, so OT is a type of healthcare that helps to solve the problems that interfere with a person's ability to do the things that are important to them. So here I was in that class near the end of my professional program, just about to be an OT. And it was actually one of the first time that we were discussing parenting and disability at the university in my program. And I think it's when it hit me the most, how little sense that made to me. I think for many individuals, parenting is very significant. But hearing for the first time in 4.5 years about that significant role for individuals living with all sorts of impairments and disabilities made no sense to me. So I was kind of having the shivers when I was watching that video in class, and I jumped out of my seat at the end of the class and went to Dr. Bottari. And for those who have the privilege of knowing her, she may be very straightforward at times. And I was just having the goal of saying what a great class it was and how much I enjoyed the talk we had around parenting. And she asked me a very straightforward, "Oh, do you want to do a PhD?" And although at that time, I guess my answer was, "Wait, what?" And then perhaps something around, well, maybe not just yet, but I was interested in knowing more about that possibility. Yeah, I think it really started to grow on me, the topic of parenting and disability. And just about 2 years later is when I entered the graduate studies at the School of Rehabilitation. So starting my PhD in rehabilitation studies, again, at University of Montreal.
Wow, this is like a great story. That's fantastic. I love it. And I love it for different reasons. As you were talking, you know, the first event that you talked about, which is Parent Plus. So, you know, being there as a student watching or like seeing all the adaptations. And it made me think of when I saw all the adaptations. So it was like a few months after my accident. I was in a wheelchair. And it was actually, I say a few months, but it was actually more than 6 months after. And I couldn't believe that even though parenting had always been part of my intervention plan, I was only introduced to the clinic like maybe 8 months after my accident. Which meant that my son was like already too old, because my son was 2 years old, to fit in most of the equipment that I saw. But I was mesmerized. So your recollection of that first time seeing all the adaptations, I think I had the similar reaction to it, because it was just like so fantastic to be able to see all of those equipment that could be used by anyone to really sort of, you know, make us capable of doing parenting tasks the way that we want to, and to do them as much as we can on an independent way, like not having someone to help us out with it all the time. So I think that that's a great part of your story, definitely. And I love how, without knowing, people knew already or had recognized the passion that you had in yourself about this topic, and how, you know, it sort of like led you to where you are now. So that's, I love those stories about like beginnings, how it starts. So now you are at the stage where you're actually waiting to hear a date where you could defend your thesis.
That's right.
So it's a very stressful time, because we're just like sort of waiting about what scholars are thinking about your thesis and your research. So let us bring back everybody to when you started, because you're almost done, but let's start with what you did in your PhD, and what results you got, and what lessons you would take from that.
Absolutely. Well, as you know, a PhD is during a few years, and it's like a marathon, and I did a number of studies. I think one study I would like to showcase today is a study in which you had actually some major contribution, and I thank you for that, Marjorie. So actually here in the province of Quebec in Canada, I believe, to my knowledge, we conducted one of the first, and it's kind of funny to say that because we're in 2022, one of the first studies about early parenting with a physical disability here in the province of Quebec. And I would say one of the first involving multiple stakeholders. So actually involving or hearing the voices, making sure the voices of numerous plural participants are being heard. And by that, we conducted a focus group study with, of course, parents themselves, spouses, rehabilitation clinicians, community organizers, and some scholars, so researchers in the field. And as funny as it may sound, I would argue that the field of parenting and IDD is much more mature than the field of parenting and physical disability. So yeah, we're kind of starting at the basics. So with that study, our purpose was really to explore what were the needs and what services and resources were made available to the families headed by parents with physical disabilities. And we were really open, so we considered parents with a number of clinical diagnoses, either parents with cerebral palsy, some had, for example, a spinal cord injury and concussion, others traumatic brain injury, and so on. All were reporting in that study their experience of parenting a young child. So we've specifically focused on children aged between 0 to 5 years old, as I know you know how the issues are different as children grow and evolve and so on. So we kind of focus on the preschool period here for that study. And we're just still waiting to hear back from the journal where we submitted. So hopefully this study will be published and available to the public very soon. I think with that study, there was a number of findings that really struck us. So, of course, maybe one which is a little bit more self-explanatory is how much the participants in our sample, so we were actually fortunate to have 35 participants in our qualitative study. They were, of course, a lot of them reported the lack of physical accessibility. So some parents, like we discussed previously, use a mobility aid or equipment, and a lot discussed how difficult that may be, in part, if not foremost, due how our society is actually inaccessible for persons with physical disabilities. So going out and about from your home to some public facilities like daycares and schools and the library and so on, that can be very difficult for someone who uses, for example, a wheelchair and has also a young one to take care of. So I think that would be one of the first findings that was really evident in our study. In parallel, and I know that was a topic of discussion in your previous episodes, is how society can also be unwelcoming for parents with physical disabilities in all sorts of ways, conscious or unconscious, due to the biases and prejudice some may have in thinking about parents with physical disabilities, thinking, for example, that these parents are a struggle, that they're not capable, which of course research has demonstrated is not true in many ways. So I think there's still a lot to be done in how society actually makes parenting easier for everyone, and that includes, of course, parents with physical disabilities as well. And in discussing how society actually, what place is given to parents within society, participants also highlighted how services were actually either disconnected from their own reality of parenting with all the strengths they have. So for example, I do remember one father in our study sharing, when we asked the question, can you talk a little bit about the services that you received as a father? And his answer was, what services? And this is in spite of actually having a program like Parents Plus here in Montreal, which he benefited from. But like you said, Marjorie, currently that program is for 0 to 2 years old. So parents having 0 to 2 years old. I know they're working very hard to actually expanding their services to include more parents and children of different age groups as well. But still, that father shared how he felt, he perceived that services were very little aligned with what was his most significant role, his fathering role. So I think there's, again, a big reflection that should be made in terms of what services are made available to these families and these parents. And I know Dr. Llewellyn kind of discussed this in terms of having specialized services for parents, but here again, participants complained how services in the general population were inaccessible or unadapted for parents with physical disabilities.
You summarized it very well in terms of what the parents brought forward. I remember also, because I was part of the focus groups, staff, and clinicians sort of saying also and admitting to not having enough services or not having enough resources to be able to either help the clients that they had or to help more clients that they know they could have if only they were allowed to offer those services. And so feeling sort of frustrated with, a system that sometimes does not allow us who care and who want to help actually. And that was a big thing. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about sort of what, those clinicians said, or, the other like community organizations as well?
Absolutely. So clinicians, some of them actually, and researchers as well, mentioned how services could be disconnected. So for example, and this all circles back how services are actually organized within our health and social care services system. So for example, here in Quebec, we have services for children and we also have services for adults. But then again, those two types of services don't necessarily collaborate well or collaborate on a regular basis. Whereas when we discuss parenting, well, we're actually discussing a family unit. So we have a parent who takes care of a child. There's maybe another parent involved, a spouse, a caregiver, a significant person, and so on. So basically our client, it's not just one individual, it's a whole family system that we're talking about. And so I think our systems need to work better together at first to make sure that parents are being heard and receive the services that they are entitled to receive. I think that was one of the key messages that was shared within the focus groups. I think another key message was perhaps in terms of how some participants perceived that there was a lack of training around parenting and disability. within the current realm of things. So, and again, for example, if we draw back to my how I entered the field, so my own set of examples, I could witness firsthand how parenting was not or very little discussed within my own program, when one would actually expect that parenting would be discussed in 4.5 years, right? So I think this is also another topic of discussion, how we make sure that the people who will actually assess and intervene with parents with disabilities, and I think we could argue any kind of disabilities at that point, how they're actually trained and prepared to work with these families, and what is actually out there for them in terms of continuing education, and what do we have in terms of university materials, courses that integrate disability within their curriculum.
I love this because as you're talking, of course, you've listened to the first few episodes. I'm up ahead because I know what's coming. And some of the episodes that are coming that are right before yours are actually with Susan Collins, who is a researcher from Australia. And we have a beautiful interview that's coming also with twins of twin daughters of Amanda, who is a mom with intellectual disability. And in both of these interviews, you know, the twins and Susan also mentioned about services being disconnected and not taking into consideration the family as a whole, but also every role in that family as a role that they need to take into account, take into consideration, and work with. And so an example that Beth and Lily gave us was, you know, talking about how services were offered to their mother, but they weren't offered to them, the kids, the children. And so whatever services they needed was always coming from the angle of their mom. But they were saying, like, we also had sort of needs in terms of maybe understanding how we should explain to mom certain things, or you know, if we struggled about the stigma, and how can we do that? And Susan, in her research, which is research where she talked to children who were in that middle school age, so around 7 to 12 years old, also brought up sort of the need to basically sort of be taken care and by the services and taking into consideration, basically. So it's sort of like, to me, it's beautiful because it's sort of like highlighting a point that's very important, that and that many of us have highlighted and know, you know, that it's necessary to be able to offer support to the spouse, to offer support to the kids, that it's not just about, you know, the parenting. And when parenting happens, like after parenting, or rather when parenting happens before the accident, like for me, an example, offering support to, you know, my child who was also reacting to the changes that my injury happened is also necessary. So I think that that's beautiful because it really talks about sort of the need of looking at services in a way, in a different way.
Absolutely. And if I can add to that, I think it's a tendency, or even it's more than a tendency. Future healthcare professionals are more and more being trained to be client-centered, patient-centered, whatever the terminology you're familiar with. And for example, as an OT, we learn at the university to be family-centered when we're working in pediatrics, so with children. But it's as if when we consider the adult, when at that period of time, we're kind of losing the focus of being family-centered. for those who already parent, like yourself, for example, Marjorie, or those who are thinking about it, that maybe it's something that they would like someday to do. So I think that's something I would like to critique within my own field of study and clinical work. We should learn a little bit more to be family-centered with adults and not only with children.
Yes, great point. Great point. So that's a beautiful thesis that you gave us and research. I can't wait for people to have access to it. And of course, there will be a mention in terms of where to find the article once it will be published, because I'm sure it will be. So that will be part of the show notes for sure. If we were to look now more in terms of the future, you're going to graduate soon. What happens after?
Well, I know in one of the previous episodes, so I was really a keen listener, as you may see. You mentioned that there's a momentum around parenting and disability, and I see all sorts of clues actually pointing in that direction as well, Marjorie. So I'm really optimistic and really excited about what the future holds. Now, from my perspective, I am so grateful actually to have been awarded a Canada Institutes of Health Research scholarship. So I will be in just about a few weeks starting my CHR research fellowship program at the University of Toronto Scarborough with Dr. Hilary Brown, which I hope you've heard of actually, as she's been producing some great research work around mothers with disabilities, and she's actually the first in Canada, to my knowledge, to produce some population-based data around mothers with disabilities. So that's huge, and that's actually great, because when I started my PhD, I had no argument in terms of recent statistics to put forward, as this is an issue of interest for a lot. So I'm happy that those are actually available and out nowadays. And so as a postdoctoral fellow with Dr. Brown, we will be investigating and conducting a number of projects, but one which is close to my heart is circling back to what we've been discussing previously in terms of educating clinicians. Our goal is to develop a web-based training modules and specifically intended for healthcare professionals such as physicians, midwives, lactation consultants, etc., who are actually working with mothers with disabilities. So we would like to create a set of training modules which will be online, evidence-based, informed by the lived experiences of mothers with disabilities, and that will serve continuing education purposes for healthcare professionals already out there and giving their best, right? But giving our best doesn't mean that it's always evidence-based, although we're well-intentioned. So I think having this sort of training specifically intended for healthcare professionals on the topic of mothers with disabilities and perinatal healthcare will be something I hope very useful.
Yes, definitely. I look forward to the future with that in mind, for sure. It makes me think of a mom who did a beautiful documentary, and I'm hoping that this documentary, by the time that this podcast is finished, that it will be shown to many. And her story is really about how she went through pregnancy while being a quadriplegic. And it really showcases, you know, sort of the work that she had to do with clinicians in terms of making sure, you know, that she picked the ones that would support her in that role versus sort of discourage her choice of becoming a mom. And so anything in terms of supporting clinicians, but also in a way opening up opinions and attitudes to pregnancy and disability, I think is very much needed for everybody. I'm sure the parents would agree, and I'm sure also the professionals would agree, as often we feel a bit sort of led down by our professional orders or, you know, our schools. And for some of us, the school has been a long time behind us. So it's always good to see it in terms of continuing education as well. So I am at the last question of the podcast, which is, if you were to speak to workers who work for child welfare, what is the one thing you would like them to retain from our conversation today?
I think it's a great and important question. And I would like to have a conversation with them, an extended conversation. But if I had only one thing to say, and perhaps it's not that original, but I think we need to go back to basics at some point. And I would like to tell them, like other scholars have been telling in the field of IDD, so don't assume that parents cannot parent because they have a physical disability. This is absolutely a false assumption. We have data that demonstrates the contrary. Don't misinterpret that because parents have needs, that they cannot parent. Try instead to find resources or services that can help parents and their families to live meaningful lives, and promote what is perhaps one of the most meaningful roles they will have to do.
Yes, that's a good one. I'll tell you that as you were talking, and I think it was a conversation that you and I had in the past, you know, where we reflected upon the fact that we offer services to children who have disabilities, and society is very open to offering services and support to these children. Yet we forget that these children actually grow up, and when they grow up, they become adults with disabilities who have been pretty much taught all their lives that yes, you can, and see, I can support you, and services are there to teach you and to show you that things can be done differently. And so we need to continue that message to show to these kids that we've, you know, supported all these times, these years, to basically continue and sort of say yes, and now you're going to live to be, you know, adults that are self-actualized and who can, you know, decide for yourself if you want a family and how many kids you want, and if you want to get married or not, and how you want to raise your children. And we are going to help you in terms of making sure you have all the resources to be able to do that the way that you want to do that and you've dreamt about it. And I think that, you know, ending on that note in terms of reflecting about what we can do as workers to make that future happen is definitely something to thrive towards, definitely.
I couldn't agree more. And I have a short story to share here at the end, because I think it really is on point. So at the start of my career, I was actually working as an OT with teens. And just to say how for many parenting is like ingrained within our DNA, and we aspire to that role someday perhaps. So in my caseload, I had one teenage girl, and she was seeking my services in occupational therapy. She wanted to be the most independent possible. And when I asked her why she was doing all those efforts, well, she basically answered something like, well, someday I will be a mom, so I need to be able to cook for myself. So here she was on the edge of having 16 years old, but she already had this end life goal of being herself a mom one day. So definitely, I think we're teaching all those life skills to our children who live with a form or another of disability, but we need to make sure that these children, once they grow and become adults, they still thrive in our society, uh, whatever that form that takes, if it's in the form of parenting or not.
Yes. I thank you so much for this conversation. It was an awesome, very inspiring, and very energizing conversation. So thank you so much. And I invite everyone to follow your career, because I can foresee your career of being just really plain special. And you are definitely, in my mind, one of the rising stars of this field. And I thank you for all the work that you do and for all the advocacy that you do as you're doing your research. And I look forward to seeing you work on all those future projects of yours. So thank you.
It's an absolute honor to be invited to your podcast, and congratulations on the fantastic work you're doing with the podcast.
Thank you so much. All right.